if you think about it, like engineers are not cheap, right? They're specialized. So, if we have a great algorithms engineer, UI engineer, whatever, like that's what we want them to do is like solve problems in that domain and not worry about security. So that doesn't mean like you have no responsibility, like you still need to sort of participate, but by and large, we wanted to take care of the really difficult security problems for them.
Welcome to a new episode of All Aboard, the podcast where we talk to industry experts and practitioners about how they're tackling the toughest problems in IT and security today. I'm your host, Alex Bogey, CEO and co-founder of Conductor One. In today's episode, I have the pleasure of hosting Jason Chan. Jason has an illustrious career in security. He led InfoSec at Netflix for over 10 years and created one of the most forward-thinking security cultures in the Valley. In our conversation, Jason shares how the Netflix security team kept up with the company's explosive growth and digital transformation. We also dive deep on platform engineering, Netflix's well-known open source involvement, and Jason's advice for someone who's just getting started in security. Let's get into it. Jason, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. I know you're a busy man. I was really... First of all, we got a chance to get connected, I guess it was a few weeks ago, and I know that your background was at Netflix. You ran information security there for a good period of time, had a great run there. And from my understanding from talking with you, and then also just you're pretty well known out in the security industry, is that you guys did a lot of really interesting things at Netflix, particularly around platform engineering and security platform engineering. And it was really excited to explore that topic with you and go a little bit deeper today. Can you maybe just give everyone listening like the 5-minute or sort of like talk to me like I'm five explanation of what platform engineering is and maybe a little bit of flavor on that as well around security.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Alex. I love to talk about security and platform engineering. If I were going to try to explain it to say a 5-year-old, I'd probably use a couple of analogies, and I'll use a couple of playground analogies since we're talking 5-year-olds. So first I would say, like, if you're a 5-year-old and you want to like make sandcastles, right? That's kind of your thing, right? You want to do your art and you want to sort of build your thing, and you don't really care about building the sandbox and filling it with sand and making sure it's clean. So I kind of think of the platform engineering team as the team that sort of creates the sandbox and kind of manages it for you. And I think another kind of important analogy, and of course these aren't perfect, but they sort of give you a flavor for it. Another kind of playground analogy I would say is a seesaw or a teeter-totter, right? It's kind of like, if you're familiar with that, I would say it's like if you've ever done that with your friend, you see how easy it is. Maybe your friend weighs 100 pounds or 200 pounds, but just by like sitting on this lever, you can make them go up in the air pretty high, whereas you couldn't do that without the seesaw. So I think of platform teams, they're also kind of a unique way of creating leverage for an organization. So basically, like, you get out of it more than you put into it. And that was the team that I joined when I joined Netflix in 2011. It was called Cloud Platform Engineering. I think it was about a dozen people at the time, and I sort of came in to think about security. And that's really what we were trying to do. We recognized, Netflix was at kind of an important transition point as it moved from being mostly like a DVD by mail business to streaming streaming subscription video. What we were trying to do was unlock a lot of innovation on top of the public cloud at a time when those patterns and practices and mechanisms weren't really well known. So we were, in addition to kind of try to make it easy for the rest of the engineering audience, we were doing a fair amount of, I guess what you'd call pathfinding. So trying to figure out, what's the right way to kind of build and operate large scale distributed systems in the public cloud. And, at a time that was, I think if you were going to do a startup now, it would probably be your natural approach is to sort of launch in the public cloud. But, Netflix started moving there, I think in 2008. So, that's 15 years ago. So there weren't really any large companies doing it at the time. And even when I started 2011, it was still pretty early. So yeah, a lot of it was, we were trying to figure out, frankly, just kind of like how to do it the right way.
Yeah. And can you click in a little bit? I'm really curious because it sounds like it was definitely a journey to mature that like organizational competency around what a platform, the responsibilities of a platform engineering team and what they were responsible for versus maybe like what individual developers were responsible for. Presumably that cloud native migration shift and embracing kind of cloud infrastructure helped drive a lot of that thinking for Netflix specifically. But can you click in a little bit to what did the team look like? You said 11 people in 2011. What were some of the processes? What did the tooling look like versus what does the tooling look like today? Or like, what were some of those big shifts that you made either around principles or team or infrastructure or automation?
Yeah, so I'm trying to, when I started, yeah, it was. I think the overall company was maybe 500 or 600 people, so it wasn't huge. By the time I left in 2021, it was about 10,000. Yeah, in terms of what we were doing, so we were really like in the process of moving big parts of the service to AWS. So a lot of what we were doing in the platform team was sort of building mechanisms to do like a lot of it was data management because we still had our primary subscriber database was in the data center. All the payments infrastructure was in the data center. So a lot of it was like figuring out, how to do sort of like dual rights to make sure things got committed to the data center as well as in the cloud. We used to talk a lot about the phrase we would use was called Roman riding, which was, if you're like, I guess back in the gladiator days, you ever see like somebody riding two horses, they have like one foot on each horse. And it's like, it's very cool looking, but like incredibly unstable, right? So you're like trying to like manage this process where you're doing some things in the data center, some things in the public cloud. So that's what a lot of the tools were. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the security side, there really was nothing because I was kind of like the first person to start on that side. There were a couple of folks working in the IT team working on security, so like kind of corporate security. And then I sort of came in to think about security in the public cloud and what are the mechanisms, what's the infrastructure that we needed to kind of make that possible. But I mean, I think there were some things that were, I would say, like incredibly advanced, even if I look through today's lens. So like our use of immutable infrastructure and kind of ephemerality and auto scaling. So it was quite advanced, even when I started. And then we really kind of built out from there, especially in things like deployment. And a lot of what we were trying to do was we were trying to make things faster and safer, right? So we knew we needed, I mean, if you, I think it was like Mark Andreessen said in like 2011, right? That software is eating the world, right? And so if you think about that, what does that really mean? It means, well, pretty much every company to some degree competes based on their ability to develop and operate software. And we absolutely viewed that as a big differentiator for us. So we put a lot of energy, a lot of investment into making developing software easy and operating software easy. So that's a lot of what we spent time on.
And so it sounds like you had some of the foundations when you joined, and they were embracing everything you said, right? Ephemerality, kind of immutability around infrastructure, and that journey was happening. Were there specific investments or things that you did along that journey that you found really created that, to use your metaphor before, like that seesaw leverage effect with your internal customers? And can you share maybe like one or two of those big wins? Or even stories, examples?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that I would give credit to, like my manager who hired me and the rest of the org was they really viewed security as like fundamental and integral to like their ability to operate. So they didn't view security as like this add-on of like, well, let's do whatever we want to do. And then, security will kind of patch things up. It was a very, very integrated mentality. And I think that really served us well. And even like as the team grew, we were building and operating key parts of the streaming product ourselves, the security team was. So we were on call. We owned, tier one services. So I think that was pretty important just in terms of like, setting the stage for how security was going to operate with the rest of engineering. And I think, and I don't know that we were ever like super explicit about some of the like philosophies of some of the tools, but we really thought about like developer experience and developer productivity and like what is the interface between the end developer and the infrastructure that they're building on top of. We really wanted that to be, really smooth and integrated. So a lot of the tools that we built for the purpose of like whether it's deployment or administering systems, they were I don't even want to say dual purpose, but they were like a single tool that met the needs of multiple constituents. So certainly the end users, but also like me as the security person, but the folks who are working on observability or performance or efficiency or even things like cloud costs. So we didn't really build a single purpose tool that only one team used. So all of those were dual or multi-use systems. And I think that's certainly something philosophically that I carried forward was, hey, what are the other sort of systems and techniques that adjacent teams to my own are using, and what are they how are they being successful, and are there pieces of that I can sort of pull into my own portfolio so I'm not rebuilding.
It's interesting because to hear you describe it sounds so similar to like a traditional software building process with like product managers, and you're sort of working with like external customers and really thinking about how do I make it's like, but I guess the difference there is that internally those were your customers at Netflix, but your sort of the philosophy was exactly the same, like building this for multiple use cases, multiple internal constituents, making sure you're like really focused on their experience and making them super happy. Does that resonate with you? And like, did you even internally, did you think about the platform engineering team as kind of like serving the business and serving a bunch of internal customers, even to the point of maybe like taking feedback on them for roadmap and things like that?
Oh yeah, definitely. I would say that was very much the approach. In those early days, we didn't really have like traditional product managers, but I definitely, I mean, having been a product manager earlier in my career, I carried that forward. And yeah, because when I started, I started as an individual contributor at Netflix. So I mean, I was just kind of building alongside everybody else, and my scope was much smaller. I was really just focused on kind of cloud and product security. I mean, eventually, we sort of grew and the scope grew, but those early days, it was really about focus. And I'll kind of use this story that I've used a couple times before, but I mean, it kind of maybe helps highlight sort of the way that we thought. It was actually the very last social event I went to before lockdown, right? So it was just a little bit over 3 years ago. And we were at like security happy hour in San Francisco. And I was talking with somebody from another kind of like large cloud forward company. And she was telling me that, their CTO really wanted every engineer to think security first, right? And to be like, that was like, and I thought that's a totally reasonable and probably pretty energizing approach, especially for the security team, because it makes it really clear what your priorities are. But then I also told her, I was like, actually at Netflix, we think pretty much like the exact opposite. Whereas we want developers to focus on what they're hired to do. So if you think about it, like engineers are not cheap, right? They're specialized. So, if we have a great algorithms engineer, UI engineer, whatever, like that's what we want them to do, is like solve problems in that domain and not worry about security. So that doesn't mean like you have no responsibility, like you still need to sort of participate, but by and large, we wanted to take care of the really difficult security problems for them, very much in like the philosophy that Amazon has with like, undifferentiated heavy lifting. And because I also thought too with, security it's a big domain, and it's a high consequence domain. And I don't want people having to make decisions in that kind of domain if they don't have the expertise. So I would prefer to handle the security sensitive stuff via local domain expertise within the security team, but let the engineering team sort of like innovate and iterate in whatever domain they specialize in. I personally think that that's a better use of companies' resources. So that's really like the way we structure. That was like key to the overall philosophy of the Netflix security team, and I would say more broadly, the Netflix platform engineering team.
That's really interesting. It's like this concept of sort of secure by default, or like transparent security in what you're doing. I have a feeling this is related to, but maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, the paved roads concept that Netflix, I feel like, really evangelized and talked a lot about very publicly around, maybe just stop there. Can you talk a little bit about that concept of paved roads? I think you touched on it just now, but maybe go a little bit into detail, kind of explain what that means and even what the metaphor means.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the metaphor, it's kind of like if you had to get someplace, like, physically you had to sort of move your body throughout the world to get to some destination. Like there's a bunch of ways you could do that. And so our idea of creating a paved road was like, hey, we've already kind of built the infrastructure. We have a nice smooth path for you to go down. It's predictable. It's well supported. That doesn't mean you can't choose a different way. Maybe you want to take a machete and kind of hack your way through the jungle to get there. That's fine. That's probably going to be like more unpredictable. And you're going to have to do a bunch of stuff yourself. So we kind of thought of the paved road, and you'll hear other metaphors like, golden path or well-lit path. I mean, I think they're roughly the same. I would kind of think of them as you have central teams that are, like platform or security. They have well supported solutions for identity management or whatever it is. And like that becomes a paved road. Like you can use this and this will kind of let you get to your destination quicker and more smoothly, more predictably. Doesn't prevent you from going and do your own thing. But I think part of that was I kind of think of companies generally have a lot of different central teams and not just in technology. So maybe it's facilities, right? Maybe it's human resources, maybe it's legal. All of those central teams are looking for ways where they can better serve their constituents in kind of a smooth way that will allow them to scale. And paved road was the sort of metaphor of the approach that we
To make that, like a super tactical or like grokkable example for the listeners, is there like an example of a paved road that you could share that maybe you found particular success with at Netflix?
Yeah, I think probably the most dramatic example I would have was, as Netflix went from becoming, because not to go into too much history of the business, but, Netflix started in streaming by taking content that other studios had already created and then putting it on the service. So they weren't actually creating content. Around 2013, we decided we basically wanted to be a studio as well and create our own content. So if you think about, the systems that we needed to build to make that happen, to serve all the different productions, because each production, like each TV show or movie is kind of like its own little business, right? And they've got like systems they use and they've got wireless networks and printers, but they might only last 6 months, right? Because however long it takes to film. And as we started building applications to serve that population, so to serve like production crews, there was more and more demand where people wanted to be able to access those from anywhere, right? They didn't want to be on a VPN because they're being accessed by third parties, not employees. And so it was this idea of like, how do I as a developer get a system that I built onto the public internet? And when we started that journey, it was kind of embarrassing because we had like a 20-page Google Doc that said like, here's all the things you have to do. And it was like, no, this is just not acceptable because, the developers, they spend all their time on functionality and they're like, okay, it's time to go live. I should just hit a switch. And we gave them this 20 pages of garbage. So we eventually kind of through iteration, but we ended up building a system called Wall-E. I think it was, I forget the movie, but I think it was actually called Wall-E. But it was basically like an identity aware proxy that I, as a developer, could just publish my app behind. And by doing that, I would get all like your SSO and I would get logging and I would get like anti-DDoS and sort of, all that kind of stuff just by opting into it. And I didn't have to worry about like, how do I integrate that or make that happen? So to me, that was like a really dramatic example of paved road where you go from your original paved road. It was that Google Doc because we're telling you, this is the best we had. So it was that paved road. It was probably had a bunch of gaps in it and it had some potholes, but it was still like the supported way. And then we felt there was sufficient value in sort of continuing to invest. So then that's when you came up with Wall-E. So you go from a 20-page doc that you had to sort of manage manually to like, I just opt in my deployment.
Yeah, it's like you got the massive checklist, the 20-page checklist, or like the technical solution you can work that solves the checklist for you. That's pretty awesome. Can you talk for a second, this is switching gears maybe a little bit, but one of the things I've always really appreciated, at least from outside looking in at Netflix, is how much the company's contributed to the open source community. You guys have a lot of popular projects in the open source space as it relates to security, particularly Bless, Lemur, RepoKid, Security Monkey, just to name a few. I'm really kind of curious what you didn't have to do that as a team and as a company. And I'm really curious what drove that. Like, why did you guys publish those projects to the open source community? Was there any sort of philosophical thinking around that in particular?
Yeah, a few things I think are good to dig into. So first, really at the time, as we were moving to AWS, a lot of those problems weren't really solved or they weren't really well understood. So as we kind of came up with solutions, our idea was, well, let's show our work and like put it out there, see if people agree with this. Like, do you think this is a reasonable way to solve this problem? If not, what are some other ways to go about it? So that's what a lot of the real early open source was about. And we also we actually created this thing called the Netflix Cloud Prize in 2013, where we basically invited people to kind of innovate on top of our open source, and we brought people to the AWS conference and gave away money. So it was pretty neat, and I would say also, at the beginning, where Netflix was a much smaller company, 500 or 600 people, it wasn't really really well known as like a kind of a tech brand. If you think about Fang, like that wasn't really a thing back then. So we were trying to establish ourselves as like a reasonable alternative to, like Google or Amazon or other places like that for great engineers to work. So that was part of the open source strategy. And within security, part of the reason we did it was certainly to align to that broader strategy, but also I strongly believe that we as defenders in security should be sharing with each other, whether it's going to conferences and talking about things, talking about incident postmortems or open source. So I was really big into that. Not that I was, forcing folks to open source stuff, but my thought was a lot of these problems are not necessarily unique to Netflix. So to the extent that we have a reasonable solution to a problem, let's go ahead and put it out there. Let's share it.
Yeah, and you touched on something that I think maybe is one of the hardest things to do as a leader and a manager, which is that kind of cultural aspect of building a team. And clearly, like part of the open source strategy, it sounds like to a degree was a little bit of recruiting driven, right? So it's like, we're working on really interesting problems. You're getting that news out there. You're letting people know that Netflix is more than just delivering DVDs in the mail. I'm kind of really curious, like, taking that a step further, were there things that you looked at or that you look at in general, specific considerations to culture, skill sets, whatever it might be, when you're hiring someone on the security team who's going to be a part of that platform engineering team? Are there things that you looked at, like orientations, again, kind of culture, skill sets?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So, because I think, with security hiring, it's always hard, but I would say that when I was first hiring, I think I first hired my first person like in 2012. So it was just me for about a year and a half. And then as I started hiring, I mean, I would say broadly, I was looking for people that could sort of complement my own skills and abilities. But, real broadly, I think at the early stage of building a team, you're really more looking for more generalists than specialists, right? Like your first hire in security is not going to be somebody who can like reverse engineer malware, right? That is just not as broadly applicable. So I was really more looking for just like, kind of experienced generalist security engineers that could also build software. I thought that was pretty important. So I think we were definitely sort of early in the trend of hiring software engineers into security. And then, from there, you eventually become specialized. But you're really looking for folks that had a decent background. But I think, maybe even more important for that, probably like the number one, I wouldn't even call it a skill, but I would say mindset I would look for is like really pragmatism and practicality, and really people who were had less of like a black and white view to security of like this is how it must be done, and who could kind of understand ambiguity and because we were generally solving problems that didn't have great solutions out there. Like I remember early days of having to like educate our external auditors about, cloud and, continuous deployment and how does that factor into SOX or PCI. So, you had to have people who were, I think, open-minded and really sort of valued, I hate to say biased to action, but we're really just didn't really necessarily have preconceived notions about what a solution needed to look like. And we're really just more driven to like, hey, let's get this thing done. We might have to do a little bit of inventing on the way to get there. So I think because of that, because we knew a lot of those solutions for what are the problems we had at the time, they weren't available in the market. We knew we were going to have to do some building on our own. So I was also looking for people who had done some building and not just implement.
Yeah. So builders, comfortable in ambiguity, generalists, maybe a little bit of security background, but yeah, it sounds like people are just willing to jump into the trenches, get out the shovel and like start building things, even if it wasn't perfect, solve problems. Can you talk, I'm really curious because you had a really long run at Netflix, and I'm sure you have a lot of war stories of things that went well and things that didn't maybe go so great during the time as well. if you could change or do one or two things differently, if you could rewind back in history and kind of like learn from your mistakes and like prevent those pitfalls, anything you could share there, maybe like an example of something you might do differently if you had a second go around on it.
Yeah, I think probably at a high level, and I think this is really just kind of speaks to my own leadership style. Like over the course of my career, you become to learn, you come to learn, or hopefully you come to learn how important communication is, and a lot of it, especially at an executive level, is just kind of repeating yourself like a bunch of times. So I think I would have spent more time, communicating the philosophies, communicating the strategy, the vision, the approach, and not just assuming that people had read that one memo I wrote or had attended that one meeting where I talked about it. Because a lot of it is just that constant drumbeat, because we talked about paved road earlier. Like that was something you just repeat it. You like, this is the philosophy and leverage. And like, you hear about abstraction and all these things over and over. But it's kind of like, well, if somebody just started at the company today, well, they weren't in last week's meeting. So you have to kind of keep. So I think that was something that, I probably back then I viewed it as a waste of time because I'm like, hey, if you want to know, just go read that doc I wrote. But that's just not how humans work. You just got to keep communicating, keep repeating yourself, and especially in multiple channels. Like don't expect somebody saw your Slack post or your Google Doc.
Totally. It's I've fallen in this trap as well. It's like I wrote it up, I sent the email out, everyone should get it right. But the reality is it's like say it again, say it a third time, say it a fourth time. Really,
Yeah,
truly.
that's kind of uncomfortable to me generally. Like I tend to not be like, you wouldn't know it from me doing the podcast, but I tend to not be like the loudest person in the room. I don't necessarily talk a ton, but yeah, I realize like that is valuable. It's important to do that.
Quick parting maybe tips for folks listening. Is there if you were talking to someone maybe that was early on in the platform, security platform engineering journey, they're just getting something going, they're getting the competency set up, maybe they're hiring their first hire, any practical tips or think like gotchas to look out for, or I guess what would you tell someone that was early on in that journey?
Yeah, I think if you're getting started, and I think this advice is relatively applicable to different kinds of situations. You might have a really expansive view, like you might want to say, hey, I want to build a security paved road where we take care of all these problems for our folks. But then like you're the first person, you have nothing, but that's what you want. So I would kind of view that as you really need to create strategic principles for how you're going to build. And so maybe one of those is like, we want to make security easy for the developer. So like, that's a principle, like you've articulated that. And now that's going to guide your sort of solutioning into building. And I always would like, it's a kind of a cheesy analogy, but I don't know, it just works for me. I would always tell people it's kind of like if you're rowing a canoe from one side of the lake to the other. Like when you're rowing a canoe, you're actually facing, like your back is facing your destination, right? So you have to paddle, but you also have to turn around and make sure you're going the right way. So you got to figure out what's the ideal mix of execution and kind of thinking. So I would say if you're getting started, like get some principles out there, some long-term strategic principles, so that as you're building, you can always use those as like, hey, let me just make sure, are we actually building and operating according to the strategic principles we laid out? And then I think by doing that, you're going to have less chance that your work sort of goes off the rails or becomes misaligned with your strategy.
Switching gears, last question before we wrap up. 2023 is wild. I feel like the last 3 years have been absolutely insane from a startup standpoint. Just in, funding, new companies, horizontal platforms, there's people going deep on projects, just a lot of things happening. Do you have any hot takes or predictions for the security market for 2023?
Dude, geez. Well, I feel like, I think it's a good thing that we're seeing a lot of funding in the security space because there's just a lot of unsolved problems. Of course, not everyone will be successful, but I generally, one of the things I would encourage, like people who are founders or thinking about starting something, is like, you don't necessarily just have to go like incremental to what's out there. You can actually like propose a completely different approach, because where we are in security, we're still like pretty early. Like there's still like a lot of unknowns. So I generally encourage people like, be comfortable like thinking differently, and don't feel like I just got to make this one solution like incrementally better, and then that's going to be my differentiator. Like maybe you have a totally different approach.
I like it. I like the philosophy of it. I mean, honestly, I think that to me, the biggest, most interesting bets are always when people kind of flip things completely, on their head and say like, well, this is like the way that this works today in the world is just not a good way for it to work. And I'm going to paint this future vision of a better world. I'm just going to make that happen in reality. And I think it's like way more interesting. I mean, don't get me wrong. Solving a problem is great, but like, it's good to like have the big vision too.
Yeah. We've got so many of those. Yeah. We've got plenty of work to do.
Yeah. Jason, I appreciate you joining. Thanks so much for the chat. It was awesome. I'm sure listeners will love hearing about building out platform engineering. And thanks for the time.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. This episode of All Aboard is brought to you by the team at Conductor One. We'd love to hear your feedback. Send us a message at allaboard@conductorone.com. Until next time.